Here we are again, everybody. Welcome to Method Airwaves. This is Doug Brown, episode 5 today, titled Skateboarding. Finally, this is a topic I'm very passionate about, and I'm excited to talk about some of the history of skateboarding, some of the people I've met, some of the travels and adventures I've had. There's been a lot. Skateboarding, from the beginning, it goes way back, before I was born, probably before you were born. I think this is an important subject because if you're a skateboarder, or if you're not as well, but if you're a skateboarder, you should know your roots. And I think unfortunately, a lot of these kids jump on a board and they get into it, but they have no idea of the legacy of certain skateboarders and who paved the way and how it happened. I mean, a lot of kids jump on a board and just assume this is skateboarding. It's always been like this. And it hasn't. There's a deep, thick root of history in skateboarding. So, with that said, we can go in a time machine here, way back. There's records of skateboarding as early as the 1950s. And the Malibu beach crowd, the surf crowd, there was a surf scene. And this is really early on in skating. And the boards were shaped just like small surfboards. So that's kind of how it happened. People would, instead of surfing, maybe the waves would dry up. Or I know with surfing, that it's something that takes place early in the morning. The waves are the highest. And so after that happens, there's something they got to do. And to emulate surfing, people would skateboard. And this went on in the 60s and 70s as well. But that's kind of how it happened in 1950s and the early 60s, particularly the year 1963, was big for skateboarding. This is way back. I mean, this is before the Beatles came to America. We're talking black and white television. And one of the big skate teams was Hobie. And they would have competitions, and it got on the news and national TV. So there was skateboarding, and it was just kind of flatland, cement, surfer-type moves, wheelies, things like that. So that happened. And but by 1965, skateboarding died. It crashed. Stacy Peralta is quoted saying, like when people would say, hey, they had to ask him, do you skateboard? And the look in their face would be, the person would say, well, isn't that like a yo-yo? Or it was like a novelty at that time. I mean, this is early on, folks. 1965, 66. Skateboarding, I should say, has always had a history early on, like a wave. It would go up and be really popular, mainstream. The world paid attention to it. Then it would crash and dive and not exist and just be not mainstream. There's always been that pattern of in and out, in and out. And that's continued. Today it's strong. It's completely different now than it was then. Even when I started skating in the 1980s, we'll get to that here. There was a time period where it was huge. Everybody was doing it. And then by the time I graduated high school, it was completely uncool. Skate shops crashed, died, no skate parks. So there's a history of it going from popular to not popular. Now with this timeline, in the early 1970s, a lot of skateboarders, they couldn't just go to a store and buy a skateboard like you can today. It's everywhere. But back then, these dudes would go to maybe a thrift shop or something like that, and they would take maybe their roller skate wheels and take those off and put those on even just like a 2x4, or they would take a door and maybe take the wood, maybe if it was oak, and they would cut and carve like a surfboard small shape. Again, everything was derived from surfing. Vert skating, get to that in a bit. I mean, it all stems from surfing. A lot of the moves, that's what these guys were doing early on. They were trying to emulate surfers. A lot of the moves, everything was kind of like, that's where you hear the expression hang 10. People do that on boards or coffin where you'd lay down. Everything was kind of surf style. Wheelies, nose wheelies. And it had that stylistic flavor to it. So that's what they were doing. Finding ways to make their own skateboards. But, and they had clay wheels. So you got to think, these guys, not like today with urethane. With these wheels, they'd hit a little pebble or anything, and boom, the board would lock up and you would eat it and crash instantly. And that happened frequently. But by 1972, a year before I was born, urethane happened with skateboard wheels. And that opened up a huge door for these skateboarders at the time to have urethane wheels. You could now grip the cement. You could roll over stones and little pebbles. You could skate any surface. So we have that time period, the early 1970s, 1972 in particular, to thank for our wheels. I mean, how important are the wheels on a skateboard? We can skate anything, but it all came from that time period. So urethane happened. Now, a lot of this, I should mention, 1970s, early 70s, when people were surfing, there's a group of people that you should be aware of. And if you haven't seen the documentary or the movie, you should, called the Z-Boys. If you don't know who the Z-Boys are, you need to get educated. Not hard to do. There's a documentary out which will really open your eyes to this time period of skateboarding. And a movie that they made called Lords of Dogtown. So we have the Z-Boys documentary. You got to see that. You have no choice. It's essential. I'm telling you right now, if you haven't seen it, find a way to get it. Online, there's DVDs out. Go to your local library, search it, watch the Z-Boys documentary. Who are the Z-Boys? Well, we got a couple cool guys. I've met both of them. There's Skip Ingram and Mr. Craig Stesick. Two cool guys that started, they were the brainchilds of that Z-Boys team, which was actually the Zephyr Surf Shop, which was owned and operated mainly by Jeff Ho, who was a surfer. And those three guys really started the whole Z-Boys team. So names to know: Skip Ingram, Jeff Ho, and Greg Stesick. Real quick story here. I met Craig Stesick. In fact, I've met a lot of the Z-Boys. When I was lucky enough, what year was this? Maybe 2004, to go to San Diego to the ASR trade show. At that time, it was early in my career, and I was riding for Yokohurst Skateboards out of Los Angeles, California, who I'm riding for again. That's another podcast. Glad to be with them. But Yokohurst Skateboards, who had great distribution, they were selling boards. I had 2 pro models out with this company. They were sending them to skate shops all over the place, had good distribution. But I was sent to the ASR trade show with Yokohurst. Okay, wow, cool. First time going to San Diego, getting paid, having some sponsors. And this trade show was cool. They had a ramp set up, and got to skate and do demonstrations and signings, and I could meet other pro skaters, and I could do demonstrations, meet other sponsors, other companies were set up. It's a big trade show. They had it twice a year at the time. It's changed since then, but this is maybe 2004 again. And I go to this trade show, and I'm helping out my sponsor. I got to do some signings, sit there, but directly beside us, what was the booth directly beside us? It was the Z-Boys booth. Whoa, this is cool. I get to spend a few days working with Yokoher and being directly beside the Z-Boys booth at this trade show. Rock and roll. So from that experience, I got to spend quality and legit time with some of these guys, which was really cool. And it was an education because I'd seen the documentary, but it was completely different talking to them. First person I met was Nathan Pratt, he'd set up every morning the thing, and I'd say, hey, what's up? And we'd talk. And shortly after that, I got to meet Craig Stesick, which was the brainchild of the whole Dogtown and Z-Boys thing. What an interesting character. I've seen videos and interviews with him. He did a lot of the writing for Skateboarder magazine, which was a huge magazine in the early 70s. And he was the one that did almost all the photography of the Z-Boys. And he had come up, he was a creative consultant with Skip and Jeff for that whole movement. And how cool was that to talk to him in person? And who else? I've met Skip Ingham a couple times, which was really neat because he was a nice guy. And I mean, he was the one that was the team manager, if anything. And Jay Adams, he discovered those guys like Tony Alva. And of course, Peggy Oki. Spending time with Peggy was cool. We did lunch together and she talked about her art and she was into my skateboarding and had a lot of questions and I was dishing it back. And the whole time I'm thinking, wow, this is really unique. I'm getting to be one-on-one with essentially a legend of skateboarding and rock and roll. How cool is that? There's so many facets to skateboarding nowadays and so many different styles, which is awesome. With skateboarding, there's what? There's street skating, there's park skating, there's vertical skating, mini ramps, mega ramps. Where did those come from? Whoa, those are huge. But it all happened way back when, the early 70s in California, Southern California. There was a huge drought. Like, people at restaurants, they couldn't serve water. People had to empty their pools, their swimming pools. They were told not to take showers to save and conserve water. In fact, it was one of the biggest droughts, I think, in history, as it's reported. And so what happened, these skateboarders that were emulating the surfers, mainly doing banks and, you know, finding stuff like that, and street skating, downhill, a lot of downhill stuff. But these swimming pools had to be emptied. So there were a ton of swimming pools in Southern California that were empty. So what did these guys do? They would hop fences. They were real calculated about it. They would find these empty pools, and if they weren't empty, they would take the water, get an electric pump, or find an outlet with, you know, anything they could do, take 3 or 4 hours and get the water out of the pool. They'd all skate it to death. Either the cops would show up or somebody would yell, bail, you gotta leave, and they'd have to go. So when they skated a pool, a lot of the times, it could be the last time that they actually skated this pool. So they had to make it count. And that's where really vertical started, because it was a huge wave. These guys that were skating street and all this were now finding new ways to be creative on their skateboard. And furthermore, they could emulate the surfers even more because you're doing that back air, you're doing that carve, much like a surfer would do. So we're in the 1970s here. And what happened in 1975, there was a huge national competition. It's called the Del Mar National Contest. And had a lot of the skaters from the mid-60s that were kind of popular, like Ty Page and Russ Howe. And they were all doing the traditional kind of normal handstandy type stuff, wheelies, nose wheelies. But there was the Z-Boys, Zephyr team, and they made a splash at this competition. Skip showed up with his team with a lot of confidence. In fact, if you've seen the movie and the story and the documentary, it's true. He went up to the judges. He had his pimp gear on with his hat. I've seen the pictures. And like a surfer shirt type looking thing, and went up to the judges and said, "Hey, where's our trophies? We're winning this thing." Just like that. Confidence. But a lot of the other skateboarders were dressed pretty traditional. They'd have maybe slacks or shorts, kind of Hawaiian type shirts, if that, or just plain t-shirts. But the Z-Boys, young guys, a lot of them were 15 or so, 16, 17, were punk rock. They had ripped jeans, and they all had this navy blue shirt. It had the Zephyr team logo on it, and blue Vans, and confidence and rock and roll. They showed up, and I believe Jay Adams was the first to compete out of their team, and it was flatland. And to them, this was kind of boring. There was no, obstacles or anything. But Jay went out there, and their style was so low to the ground, like surfers. And he had his hands on the ground, and he was carving around, and he had did like cannonball jumps. He grabbed the nose and the tail at the same time and was hopping up a few times. And he went even as far to grab the board and kind of do somewhat of a bonelessy type move off the platform onto the cement, kind of a 180 boneless looking thing. And people were just floored. They'd never seen anything like this. And a lot of the other skateboarders were kind of, what? They were taken back. So they did make quite a splash at this event. And a lot of them won, maybe second or third place. And Peggy Oki was the only girl on the team. And other skateboarders, other girl skateboarders, were going to the judges and saying, "Hey, this isn't fair. She shouldn't be competing with them." And the judges said, "Hey, she skated a lot better than some of the boys." So for women skateboarding, she opened that door too, which is awesome. Skating is for everybody. So the Z-Boys left an impression without a doubt, creating some history there. And what happened after that is that team exploded. The band had to break up, as they say, because Jeff Ho and Skip, they couldn't really afford to keep these guys on, because bigger companies like GNS and what have you were coming along and offering these guys a lot of money for sponsorships. And Steven, Stacy, Peralta, they all just kind of went their separate ways. And that's kind of how the Z-Boys stopped as far as that time period. And that changed skateboarding because it got really popular again, but really mainstream. I mean, Stacy Peralta was on an episode of Charlie's Angels, and all this stuff happened. There was an explosion. Skateboarder magazine was thriving, and it just took off. So there's that thick, heavy time period that plays a big part in today's skateboarding. And out of that whole Z-Boys crew, Stacy Peralta probably did the most financially, and he was kind of straight edge, and he took a little different route. Tony Alva, of course, was a rock star. Vans just put out recently a documentary on his life. And Tony is a cool guy. I've met Tony a few times. The very first time was, where was that? Wilmington, North Carolina. Yes, it was at the Eastern Supply Warehouse yearly party. Now, Eastern Supply, they're one of the biggest wholesalers in skateboarding in the industry. I mean, the first time I ever went there, it was a really cool experience. It was like Walmart filled with skateboard stuff everything you could think of. I mean, this is where these skate shops buy the stuff wholesale. And here I was, one of my sponsors, I was Negative One Grip Tape, flew me out there to do an event. Also, that's the first time I ever met Skip Ingham, for sure, which was really neat. And a bunch of other people. But Tony Alva, and there he was. And I talked to him, and we later went to, what was it, North Carolina? What was it? The skate barn, it was called. Man, that was a cool skate park. It was indoor and outdoor. And I saw Tony there, and what was really cool about Tony is Tony Alva, he had nothing to prove. He was just going back and forth on this ramp, but that was enough. And he's much older than me. So it was inspirational in the fact that he has nothing to prove. He's just still skateboarding. That in itself is a trick. And he's a good skateboarder. And if you look at his style and everything in the past, he's earned his stripes. I mean, he's Tony Alva. So meeting him was unique. And getting to small talk with him and having to talk about skateboarding. And, you know, the guy was cool. We had a good repertoire and something I'll always remember. And he's still skateboarding to this day. And he runs Alva Skateboards. So he went a cool direction. He started the whole Alva team and a lot of history there. And Stacy went on. And in the early 1980s, he met George Powell, who I've met also. And George Powell, Stacy Peralta, those names should sound familiar, started Powell Peralta, huge skateboard company in the early 1980s. And really in the mid 1980s, there's a documentary that you have to see. It's The Bones Brigade, the autobiography, which talks about the whole story in detail about the Bones Brigade and how it was formed and the whole bit. I'm really passionate about this because this is the time period that I jumped on. I started skateboarding around 1986. And that was one of the big companies that I was buying from. My first board, however, was a Sims, a Kevin Staub, the Pirate deck. So around this time, companies, we had Vision, which was huge, the GNS, Santa Cruz, Santa Monica Airlines, which was owned, again, by Skip. Some history there. And there were just a ton of companies, but Powell Peralta was kind of the Rolls Royce of skateboard companies at the time. I mean, they were big. Because Stacy Peralta, he was the brainchild. He was the skateboarder, where George Powell, he was the computery marketing business guy. And those two put their heads together and started this just huge thing. It started off small, but it grew and grew. And Stacy was responsible for discovering Tony Hawk and creating the Bones Brigade. I should mention another name that I talked about earlier, which was Craig Stesick. He was the one who came up with the title Bones Brigade. And he came up with the Dogtown title also with Skip. They were talking about that whole Venice, Santa Monica area. Powell Peralta happened. The Bones Brigade. That team were Steve Cavallero, Tony Hawk, Mike McGill, Lance Mountain, and Rodney Mullen. That was the core group. Now, the Bones Brigade, a lot of people don't really realize this, but they had tons of members, especially later on. So many to note. Like Para Wellender came from that. Even Mike Vallely was on the Bones Brigade. There's a name you know now. Mike started with that. Lance Mountain had discovered Mike. I guess we can talk about that. I had met Lance more than once. One time at an art show in San Diego. I got to talk to him, and that was really cool. But he was the one that did discover Mike. Mike Vallely, who is a really cool cat, who's now doing so much with Street Plant Skateboard Company and the Street Plant Battalion, which is big, with social media and all that. And I might as well talk about Mike a bit because I consider him a friend, and we've been teammates more than once. He was on Negative One Grip Tape with me. And when I first met him, it was the Gravity Games 2003, I think it was. He was riding for Sobe Beverages. And now he rides for 888 Helmets, which I have been with for geez, almost 10 years I've been riding for 888 helmets. I mean, Mike is a legend. He's really proved himself. And he's done so much for skateboarding. He's worn a lot of different hats, had a lot of different styles on the outside. But on the inside, he's still the same skateboarder. And he's a person that when I was on the road early on in my career, if I was struggling with stuff, which I was, I mean, I was going through a lot in the beginning, I could email him and he would get back to me and give me advice. And even when I saw him at some events, we had talked, and yeah, really cool cat, and happy to have crossed paths with him. But he was born in the Bones Brigade. He was part of that whole movement. And the Bones Brigade, I mean, they had some of the coolest videos. Stacy Peralta, I mean, he did a lot. He had nurtured these guys. He was a great, great coach, if you will, or team leader. Because a lot of other companies, I mean, the Vision guys, look at Mark Gator Rogalski and what happened to him. I mean, a lot of these other teams were having issues because their team managers weren't solid. Or Stacy, I mean, I think he has the record for the longest skate team staying together without breaking up. And it's because of his mentorship and how he handled the whole thing. He would get these guys to do tours and demos, and he was really engulfed into the marketing, and he was tapped into it, and he had kept those guys together. And they made some of the greatest videos. I mean, the first Pal Peralta video I ever saw, I think, was actually the second one, which was Future Primitive. The one before that was the Bones Brigade video show, which was humongous. I mean, that did a lot, because up until that time, there were skateboard magazines. And people would look at these magazines, and especially people like me from Ohio, you'd look at them and you didn't see movement. You just saw the picture. So it was more of a vibe thing. It was an artistic thing. And of course, with videos, I mean, this is the VHS days, folks. I remember getting that Future Primitive video, and it wasn't just skateboarding. Today, you have YouTube, and everything you're watching is like a minute, 2-minute clip, which is great, and it's always extreme stuff that just seems impossible all over the place, which is entertaining, which is great. But for me, I like that these were movies. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. Some of the stuff was funny, this and that. They do little storylines, and a lot of humor in those Bones videos. But they always had great skateboarding. But it was always really artistically done. There would be music. Some of the music, especially on the early videos, was little synthesizer stuff. But as the videos progressed, the music got a lot better. Budgeting was bigger, and the movies got longer. And yeah, watching Future Primitive was just awesome. I mean, again, it wasn't just a picture. You could see hairstyles, movements, and style. You could see what these guys were doing. And with VCR, you had the slow motion. You could try and figure out some moves. And I remember learning certain hand flippity things, street inverts. There's a bunch of tricks. I've met so many skateboarders in my travels. So many pro skaters. And so many. Some stick out more than others. A few that I can think of. One in particular is Ray Underhill. He was part of the Bones Brigade. He had been in a lot of those videos. I had his skateboard when I was a teenager. And he rode for Pal Peralta. And after he did the whole pro thing, he ended up working for Eastern Skate Supply. He was their marketing guy. And I first met him at Greenfield Grind Skate Park in North Carolina. I was skating this park, and there he was. He walked up, and I saw him, and I'm like, Ray Underhill. Well, yeah. And I met him and his brother, who looks a lot like him, and his young son that also skated. Well, the next day was the Eastern Skate Supply event, and I was there for my sponsor, Negative One Grip Tape, signing posters and doing some skating. Well, as I'm going there, I see Ray outside the doorway, and he's like, hey, what's up? So we talked for a little bit, and he took me to his office. He showed me, the computer stuff he was doing, and it was really inspiring because he used to be this pro skater guy, and now he's working for Eastern Skate Supply and marketing. He took his talents in another direction, and it was really cool. And Ray unfortunately passed away a few years back of cancer, brain cancer. And what an awful thing to happen to this guy who was so full of life, and he was still young, and what a tragedy. But I got to skate with Ray, and he got to see me skate, which was kind of crazy. At this event, they had a big mini ramp. It was real wide, and I was skating it and this and that, and I was skating with his son as well. His young son was on the ramp, and he was all about my moves, and I was just beside myself. And Ray was on the side of the ramp watching. So he was watching his kid, and so he was watching me skate too, and that was surreal to experience that. I'm sitting here doing all these tricks, but it was really neat afterwards. I got to sign his son a poster. He had wanted one, and just the idea that my signature and my poster was going up on Ray Underhill's son's wall in his bedroom was just crazy. And what a neat time to spend with Ray and his family, and to get to know him a little bit. And again, it's really, really sad that Ray isn't with us anymore. I did ask for his signature that day, and he always signed all his signatures, Ray Underhill, and then underneath he'd write "Skate for Life." And how inspirational is that? Because in his honor, we're all still skating for life. Live every day to the fullest. And of course, Tony Hawk, who I've met a few times. He was a big inspiration. And people always told me I looked like him when I was younger and a teenager, and I had his same haircut and style, and I bought the Tony Hawk Claw when it came out, that skateboard. So he was a role model. And Christian Hosoi, for his style. It bothers me when kids don't know who Christian Hosoi is. You gotta know that name. Christian Hosoi was like the style king back in the day. He still skates. He's awesome. When I first met him, he had just got out of jail for drug charges. He got into that, and he's turned his life around, which is great, and he's doing a bunch of stuff, a lot of outreach work. And meeting him was awesome. There was two camps back in the 80s. There was the Tony Hawk camp and the Christian Hosoi camp. It was all about the tricks, or it was all about the style. And people went, one direction or the other. I kind of went with both because I loved Tony Hawk's tricks. And style is whatever it is. And of course, Hosoi, he was the king of air. I'll never forget, what was it? Division 1985, I think it was. They did a vert ramp competition. It had all the guys just shredding every single name you could think of back in the day. And those were the rivals, Tony Hawk and Christian Hosoi. And Danny Way was always a big influence when he got on H Street. I remember that well. He was young. He was a couple years younger than me, and he was the new young guy. He was kind of the Ryan Sheckler of the day. And he went on to do great things. I'd met Danny in San Diego shortly after he did the Great Wall of China. When he jumped that was just unbelievable. So he was an inspiration for sure. A couple other guys that I've got to skate with and meet that I always remembered when I was younger. Eric Dressen, which was great to shred with him on a mini ramp somewhere in Southern California, I think 2005 or 6. And John Lucero, meeting him was cool because one of the first skateboard videos I ever really had that my friends and I watched were Let's Go Skate. And I think he rode for Vision at the time, and he ended up doing a lot of cool stuff. Like Black Label skateboards, he started that whole operation, and meeting him was definitely cool. And we can't exclude Rodney Mullen on the list of people that are inspirational, and especially nowadays. Rodney is an interesting character who's just phenomenal. He's Mozart on a skateboard. Wow, I mean, what can I say about him? But what's unbelievable is I vividly remember being at a skate shop back in the late 80s. Skate video was playing, and his skate part in the video came on, and they fast forwarded it. People saw his skateboarding and freestyle skateboarding as just kind of a side thing. It wasn't really common because he was so ahead of his time. He was doing flip tricks that people weren't going near. And he's still an innovator. He's still doing it even at his age. And he's much older than me. He's older than Tony Hawk. So that's a sign of the times, how things have changed. People used to kind of frown upon freestyle skateboarding. That's what it was known as, freestyle. They had smaller boards that the companies put out, but no one really bought them. It was kind of rare. It had such a subculture to the already skateboarding subculture, the whole freestyle thing. But time's gone by, and he's just shining brighter than ever. And I think it's great. He's invented so many skateboard tricks, and he's earned his stripes without a doubt and his respect from the skateboard community. I mean, there's so many people. I've met Steve Caballero, and that was a thrill. Just people that have inspired me that I've met. Omar Hassan, Jim Gray I got to skate with. Since we're on the 1980s, and when I started skateboarding around 1986 or so, we might as well talk about what skateboarding was like in the 1980s. I can talk about this because I lived it. Kind of like somebody that has been to war and they have war stories, or, you know, when Beatlemania happened, they were there and they say, oh, I remember this. I can do that with the skateboarding in the 80s. It was completely different than it is now. Yet there's some similarities, but to me, from what I experienced then and now, are completely different. Skateboarding in the 1980s, the mid-80s especially, it was such a brotherhood. We didn't play games of skate right away when we saw somebody. If I was at a mall or something and I saw some guy wearing a Vision Streetwear shirt, or he had Airwalk shoes, and we would instantly connect. There was a brotherhood. We'd be like, hey, what's up, man? Hey, yeah, you skate? Cool, what kind of board do you have? Oh, man, did you see the new this and that board? We would connect. Whereas now I feel like these kids show up at a skate park. It's all about who you sponsored by. Are you riding for anybody? Let's do some video footage. Let's film. Let's play a game of skate. Let's compete. Instead of just skateboarding. And that's what we did. We just skateboarded. We never sat around and talked about being sponsored or pro. I can say that. That just never crossed our mind when we skated. We were really like just these renegade kind of surfer skateboard guys that were, where can we go? We got to find a spot. We spent all our time actually doing the activity. Of course, when we weren't skateboarding, what did we do? We watched skateboard videos, a lot of that. My adolescence, like between 13, 14, and 15, was spent skateboarding a lot. I ate, slept, drank, bled, breathed, skateboarding, 24/7. My neighbor down the street should talk about who I skated with. His name was Casey. And Casey was a cool guy. He was a year under me. And when I met him, he was skating. He had a little shark board. I think it was a Nash. My first board was a Nash, the Night Stalker. And when I saw Casey, that's what we connected on. I was like, hey man, what's up? You skate? But as our friendship developed, we had a lot in common because he had lost his dad when he was younger. And I ended up losing my mom. She died from cancer when I was 16. So Casey and I really bonded on that. And we were a lot alike. We had the same fashion. And we were just these crazy teenage dudes that loved skateboarding. Some of my other skate buddies, we had Mike, who lived down the street, and Buddy, who lived down the street from Mike, and Mark, my other friend, who was very tall. That was our crew. And I was fortunate that down the street, well, first I should say the street I lived on was a cul-de-sac, a circle. So how cool was that? There was no traffic, no cars, and we would set launch ramps out and skate our brains out. It was a unique cul-de-sac because you had the circle, but above that were all these driveways that were slanted like ski slopes. So we could do a ton of downhill into this circle. And we built all kinds of ghetto launch ramps. And down the street was a college campus. And that was our skate park for sure. I mean, the college campus, there were security guys in their little golf carts that would chase us around because we were just so bad. And that was actually kind of fun at the time, you know, all these no skateboarding signs that we were responsible for. They would be chasing us. But back up to the circle that I lived in, built a lot of ramps because we didn't have skate parks. Now there's so many resources. We didn't have those. A funny quick story that I've told before in some previous podcast. I built this ramp one time. It was about 4 feet high, maybe 2 feet wide, out of particle board, duct tape. My mom was a real estate agent, and we used real estate signs, metal sheets, anything we could do to make this thing build. I mean, it looked horrible, but it was actually pretty solid. And I had it in front of the house. And one day I went to school, came home from school, got off the bus, going up the street. The ramp is gone. Where did the ramp go? Well, come to find out, the garbage people took the ramp away. Man alive, one man's junk's another man's treasure. Well, my treasure got thrown away. And that's a story. Something else we built that was kind of fun was a mini ramp. I had a mini ramp in my backyard. And it was awesome. I mean, it was a real small mini ramp. I had a friend in a neighboring town of Lodi, and his name was Joel. And he had a mini ramp in a barn of his that I had skated and just fell in love with that mini ramp. I'm like, wow, this is great. I love watching vert, but I can't build a vert ramp, and I'm not going to be doing Mick Twist 540s anytime soon. So I really liked the mini ramp, and I invited him to my house to help build this ramp of mine. So I orchestrated this team the night before. I called everybody up, got maybe 7 or 8 guys, and we planned this all out. The next morning, I had my friend show up with a truck. Mike, he didn't even skate, but I knew he had a truck. He drove, he was 16. I think I paid him a couple dollars. And I got in his truck, and we go to Moore's Lumber. This was before Lowe's was in existence. And bought maybe a couple $100 worth of plywood and 2x4s, economy studs. I remember learning that. You got to buy those cheapies at the time. It was fine. I was on a budget, man, and I was building a huge mini ramp. And we go to my house, and around 8 or 9 or so, my crew shows up. Luckily, Mark, the tall skateboarder that I was talking about, was very educated in building things. His father did a lot of woodwork, and Mark had some skills. And he taught my friends how to do this stuff. I mean, my dad was impressed by the woodwork that we were doing. We had the goggles. We could use jigsaws, circular saws. We were a little team. And also during this time period, I was fortunate enough to start my own skate shop, a legit skate shop. I was 16 years old. By this time, it was 1990. And I got my vendor's license. You have to be 18 now to get one, but back then it was 16. I talk a lot about this in my first podcast, episode 1, solo. Check it out. But what was cool was that I went legit about this. I had the local Worcester Chamber of Commerce come to my house. They had to interview me, if you can picture these guys in suit and ties, and me with my blonde hair, my mullet, my earring coming out of my ear, and my bangs. They had the Tony Hawk claw thing going on. So I was this character, and they trusted me, and I got a small loan, and they took the risk, and it all worked out. It was a great job, some really awesome times of my life having that skate shop. But I learned a great deal about skate culture during this time too, because the public was coming in, and that was awesome. And I was skating all the time. By this time, parks started to pop up after I built that mini ramp. There was a park in Cleveland that was big called the Berea Triangle, which was neat, and a couple other little spots. The first time I ever saw a pro skater in person was around this time period also, and it was Team Jobless. This was in Youngstown, Ohio, It was my birthday, and my grandparents took my friend Casey and I to the town of Youngstown, about an hour and a half, 2 hours away. And it was an eye-opener. I should mention that Team Jobless was Tony Alva's team. Fred Smith was the first pro I ever met. And how did I meet him? His board shot off the ramp and it hit my ankle, and I grabbed it and it kind of hurt a little bit, but I was just a young teenager, and getting to hand this board to him and saying, "Here you go." He's like, "Thanks, man." But for me, I was thrilled. Yeah. So back to the skate shop during that time, which it was a great time. I mean, I was making a lot of money, almost $200 a day. I learned the word profit early on. I was very fortunate that my father had a friend that owned a medical supply store, and it had a side unit that he rented to me monthly for only $50. So yeah, I was making some profit, and that business ran for a few years. But like I said earlier, with skateboarding, it's really popular, and then it has its dive and becomes completely obsolete. And that's what happened in the mid-90s. So I jumped out of that shop while I had some profit, and I was lucky. All the money I made, I threw in the bank. So right after high school, I bought a small home with that money, and that kind of set me up for the rest of my life as far as being independent, and it paved the way for my thinking. But skateboarding had changed. It had completely died, and I don't think kids really realize how bleak it was then. The skate shops all closed, skate parks gone. It was a dead time. The 90s were rough on skateboarding. However, the subculture was still there. I mean, that's what was cool about the 90s. There were some changes, fashion for sure. I mean, the Jankos came out, the chains on the side, baggy shirts, stripes, and grunge happened, Green Day, punk rock. I mean, I can go on and on about that. So it was a cool time. I kept skating. I never stopped. I had fun doing it. I believed in it, and I kept doing it. There were some companies that kind of came along, New Deal, World Industries, Blind, Flip. So the subculture was still there, but it wasn't mainstream. I mean, the industry just wasn't happening like it was before. So that was a big downslide in skateboarding, but boy, did it come back. When did it come back? Well, the mid-90s started to see a resurrection of skateboarding, mainly because of the X Games and Tony Hawk's video games. Those two big elements put skateboarding back into people's lives. It was in people's homes through watching TV, and the X Games, I mean, Taco Bell, Pepsi Corporation, they financed that, and it was huge. Up until this time, I mean, primarily you'd see rollerbladers everywhere, and it was a different scene. Skateboarders, I mean, the boards got really small. That was a change that I wasn't really down with. The wheels were like, you might as well be skating on your bearings. And I held on to all my 80s boards. Boards in the 80s, they were more fishtail looking. They were about 10 inches wide, 33 inches long. They were heavy. And people, including myself, used what called rails or rib bones. Pal Peralta made those. People to this day always ask me, what are those side things screwed onto your board? What? And they're making a comeback, because old school stuff is, like fashion. It's coming back around. But those side rails are for finger flips, and they help with sliding, but it's an accessory. Some people hate them. I held on to them. And in the 90s, yeah, I rode my old school boards, because when my skate shop closed, I still had a lot of product. So I was stocked in skateboards, wheels, and everything in between. So when the change happened into the 90s, when the boards shrank and got really light and wheels were just ultra small, I did end up winning a new school board. That's what we called them then. So I had a smaller board, and I started to learn more kickflippy type stuff. Kickflips weren't huge in the mid 80s, early 90s. You didn't see a lot of flip tricks. But as the 90s progressed, you saw a lot of that. That got really popular. Flatland got popular because people didn't have half pipes, especially vert ramps in their backyard. Not on this East Coast for sure. And so those two elements with X Games and Tony Hawk's video games, it planted the seed of, hey, this is skateboarding, and people were buying boards, and it kind of happened again. Thank goodness. I was glad. I was competing a lot during this time, just doing competitions everywhere and anywhere. And it was fun because I was winning a lot of these competitions because a lot of people just started skateboarding and I had never stopped. So I had this bag of tricks. I was pretty consistent, and boom, 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 I would compete and I'd win some cool little trophies. Not like it is today with competing and how things are. So skateboarding came back. The Gravity Games happened. Fuel TV happened. It was a small growth that just progressively got bigger and bigger, and here we are today. And not to talk about myself like crazy, because episode 1, I talk about my life story and how I turned pro and all that, which never happened overnight. It's been almost 18 years. I thought it would last a year or two. The word pro, it's kind of like, what are you? But I do make a full-time living doing this. I work for my sponsors, get monthly salaries, and I've done so many events. I don't know where to begin. And I've rode for a lot of companies. I've been very, very fortunate. But being sponsored, that's a topic. I hate if somebody's focus is just to be sponsored or to be a pro, they're missing the point. You gotta love skateboarding first. That's more important than anything. I would be doing this today no matter what, because the only payment I really need is fun and enjoyment. That's what it was all about. It's still about that to me. I get quite passionate when I talk about this, because skateboarding, that's what it is to me. Now, skateboarding, it's whatever you make it. Today, there's so much variety. There's so much stuff out there. You go to YouTube, you see these clips on Facebook or group chats. It's insane. It has got so progressive with the mega ramps and the extreme street skating. I'm just like blown away with how much it's progressed. I can't imagine what people think that skated in the 60s and 70s. They have to look at this like, whoa, it's a different language or something. But as long as your feet are on that wooden board with 4 wheels, you're a skateboarder. It doesn't matter what you do on the thing. As long as you're having fun and you're expressing yourself, you're a skateboarder. That's your title. It's, what tricks you do, that doesn't define you. Tricks are cool. Speaking of tricks, I always thought that was a strange word for it. My friend Mark thought this as well. Like tricks, like you're David Copperfield making something disappear. They really should be called maneuvers. But tricks, skateboard tricks, I get it. And for me, a lot of the tricks I do to this day were ones that I've learned in the 80s. And fortunately, they're coming back around. I'm all about being creative and original. That's number one in skateboarding. It is for me. I hate to see kids that jump into the sport and all of a sudden they're just clones. They're just, okay, I'm going to study this trick and then do it. Okay. That's why sometimes games of skate make me cringe, because you get people together that, okay, well, let's all do standardized tricks that everybody's doing. But they can't do anything original, or they've never created a trick or done something with their skating that makes them stand out, or their expression of themselves. I see skating solely as an art form. Not to be cliche or whatever, but I really do see it like that. And think of a painting. You don't want 5,000 paintings to all look the same. I think of that with skateboarders. I like people that stick out. When I'm at a skate park, I gravitate towards somebody that's different, or that's really expressing themselves and being original, or how they carry themselves, if they're having fun and if they're positive. I mean, if there's a skateboarder that's just the best skateboarder in the world over there, if he's a jerk or, just that's part of his repertoire, I mean, I don't gravitate towards that. I like positive stuff. I mean, skateboarding is a happy thing. But again, it's what you make of it. So, got a little preachy there on the whole skateboard philosophy. But it's something to think about with your own skateboarding if you are a skateboarder, that you look inward and don't let anybody define you and tell you what tricks you should do, and or tell you to stop doing a trick a certain way or whatever. Do whatever you want. That's why I got into skateboarding. There were no rules. Otherwise, you might as well be playing basketball or baseball. Which, hey, organized sports, it's great. They have their place. But I'd like to think of skateboarding as being completely original, creative, like the Olympics, which is coming up. Hey, folks, skateboarding is going to be in the Olympics. Now, I get this question a lot. What do you think about skateboarding in the Olympics? Well, I did a blog about this for one of my sponsors not so long ago. And what do I have to say? We have pros and cons, good things and bad things. Good things, to put skateboarding out there, so mainstream, so out there that it's going to reach a lot of people. And the young people, kids in particular, it's going to say, hey, look at this. It will introduce a lot of people to skateboarding, which is always good. Anything that gets a kid into it and they find themselves and they enjoy it, that's great. And it's okay to have healthy competition too. I'm not completely against that. Now, downside is that skateboarding, no rules, kind of doing your own thing, judging, trophies, that all goes against kind of doing your own thing, and somebody wants to show up and perform their stuff and have somebody say, well, what was that trick? What was that? I mean, can you judge art? Who's to judge what's the best or this or that? So there's lots of facets to that topic, and it's happening regardless. I mean, a true skateboarder is going to skate no matter what. You don't need competitions or trophies or validation. I think the Olympics needs skateboarding more than skateboarding needs the Olympics. That's a good way to put it. And skateboarding is going to go on no matter what. And it's a crazy time for skating because there's so much to it. It's progressed so much. The industry is thriving. There's so many companies. It's amazing compared to, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Now here we are. It's unbelievable. Where has the time gone? And the future of skateboarding. Look at it. I mean, wow. Kids today, it's progressing so fast. It seems like every decade doubles the decade before in maneuvers, and just the whole progression of the sport has just been exponential. And I look at people like Nyjah Huston. I had skated with him before he was pro when he was just a little kid. It was in California, San Diego, on a ramp at a demo. And he was with his dad. He wasn't even sponsored yet. And of course he was ripping like crazy, but to think how far he's come since then. Not only him, but Mitchie Brusco's another name that comes up. And when he was just a little kid, I remember him very well. Every summer I used to go out to Muskogee Woods skate camp in Toronto, Canada, and he was always there. And he wasn't even sponsored yet. And he helped film one of my early videos, my solo DVD. So I got to know him, and some time went by, and I remember talking to him on Facebook or something and just being like, wow, man, you're really going places. You're on the road with Tony Hawk, this and that. And he was keeping up with what I was doing. I was completely baffled by this. And now he's really done some groundbreaking things, landing the, 1260 spin on the mega ramp. Like, wow. It was impressive when he was doing the 900 with Tony Hawk. So he got in that whole club, and that's a sign of the times to see how much things have progressed, and he's a good example of that. Now, skateboarders' reputations and public perception. Skateboarding is interesting because of the people who choose to do it. All walks of life, which is great. A beautiful thing. Diversity is wonderful. We want all walks of life into this. I love that. But for ages, skateboarding has always had kind of a rebellious punk, no rules, against society reputation. And some of that I get and some of that I don't. But it has always had that reputation. Look at schools. You've got your football reputation, your basketball player. Schools are all about that. They'll fund stuff for that all day long. They'll spend so much money, a ridiculous amount of money, on a special football field for these kids, which is great. There's a time and place for that. But skateboarder, he's an athlete. He's doing his thing. The schools aren't building complexes of skateboard ramps and rails and ledges and skate parks at the schools. So skateboarding will always have that kind of tag to it. And I think a lot of that comes from society stereotyping skateboarders, that they're all punks and thieves and hooligans or whatever. And they're not. And that's something a lot of people don't realize, especially, society. They look at it like they're not realizing, just by judging that kid by holding a skateboard or the way he dresses or what he chooses to wear, that he's no different than that kid that's playing basketball. They're both going home to similar families. Just, there's a lot of judging that happens on people's exteriors, and that's unfortunate. I've dealt with this being a motivational speaker. I've approached several schools. I've spoke nationally for many, many years. And I talk about my life story, and I do this whole program I've called Dream Big. But a lot of schools, they hear the word skateboarder and they get leery. They think, well, what's he got to offer? I had a lady one time, I was at a store and she read my book. She came up to me and went on and on how great my biography was. And I took the compliment to heart, thank you. But then she said, I can't believe how good it was and how well written it was, because you're a skateboarder. I didn't expect that. What? Think about that for a second. She's basically saying, well, since you skateboard, I figured your IQ was low and you weren't that bright or something like that. It was insulting. And I just kind of smiled and went away. But later that evening, I thought about it and thought, wow, the world does still think of skateboarders like that. And they're always going to think that. Maybe it will change. Maybe that's a pro in the Olympics, that it could also change the perception of skateboarding. Maybe it'll be more acceptable and mainstream. But then again, devil's advocate, is that good? Is that bad? It's like a lawyer trying to debate something. It can go either way. Skateboarding has always had that kind of rebellious, against the rules and authority vibe to it, which as a teenager, it fit me. It was part of my thing, so I kind of get that. Now that I'm older, I've had some wisdom, and I see it, and I'm this skateboarder on my age, but I'm a grown man. I pay bills, this and that, and so I'm not so far removed from that teenager that's skateboarding. And here I am, skateboarding. There's so much to it, the culture, and there's so many resources now. There's competitions, there's so many companies, there's so many skate shops. You jump online. So it feeds this, which is good. I like to see skateboarding grow because it's given me so much pleasure. It's given me friends, family, unbeatable memories my whole entire life. And it's given me a career. It's how I've made a living for, again, almost 18 years. And I get really sentimental when I think about everything that's happened because of that skateboard. That skateboard has become a microphone. I travel, I do all these events, and I've become an author and a speaker. and a role model. I embrace it, and a mentor to especially young people, to kids. And that is awesome. I mean, it gives me a lot of satisfaction knowing that I can make a difference in a person's life in a positive way. Because we all need that. I mean, I get it when I read people's biographies, or if I see another speaker, or when I was a teenager and I was struggling with so much. If I would have been able to hear myself speak, at the school I went to, I think I would have liked to have heard certain things from somebody like myself, if that makes sense. With age comes wisdom and adversity. I said this before, make strong people. Going through these tough times make us stronger. Because life, speed bumps are coming. It's a guarantee. It's ups and downs like anything. But back to my skateboard, I have that to thank. I found my voice. I use my skateboard for many different reasons. I skate all the time. I do the best I can. I don't walk around and think I'm a great skateboarder. I just skate. I enjoy it. I try to progress. I always try to be creative, but I have fun. I enjoy it. And I hope that's why you're into it. Or if you're not into it, don't be afraid to get into it. Some of these kids watch videos, they get intimidated and think you have to jump on a skateboard and just do a 900 right out of the gate. And no, learn the basics. And taking it back to my start, when I first started skateboarding, I fell in love with just being able to go from A to B. I was fascinated. I was only 12 or so. I was fascinated with just being on the board and going down a hill. The idea that you didn't really have to push. You had gravity holding you down and you moved. I thought that was cool. And with my crew in the mid 80s, even just learning an ollie was huge, or a 360 rotation. I learned to navigate and move and maneuver the board before I tried to do a kickflip. All that stuff kind of happened later. I learned the basics first, and that's what I always try to tell people. You don't want to be a clone. Don't be a robot. Learn the basics. Learn to be able to move the board around. And once you get satisfaction from that, and you can grow and grow and grow and do whatever you want. For me, again, it's been about creativity. I take all the tricks that I used to know or that I learned before, and I add on to them. Or maybe I get inspired and I try something or I see something and I twist it, and I'm repeating myself, but skateboarding is what you make it at the end of the day. And it's fun, and I hope you get some satisfaction out of it. It's done so much for me. And be safe. I always tell people to wear helmets. There's another topic. Nobody seems to wear helmets anymore. Vert skaters will wear them all day long. I ride for AAA helmets. I'm proud of that. And so I do have helmets at an arm's length. But the older I get, the more I realize the importance of your brain. Now, with Athletes for Hope, I visit a lot of hospitals, children's hospitals, and I see some of these traumatic injuries these kids have, and especially head injuries. And not to scare everybody off, but some of them are really, really bad. And wow, you get metal plates in your head, and you got to think about the safety aspect. It really does blow my mind, and this might go against the current. A lot of people can just think this is crazy, but it blows my mind that I see these kids doing these 15 stair tricks, just crazy maneuvers without a helmet. If there's a time you should wear your helmet, it's that time. You can hurt your arm, your leg, your foot, whatever, but you hit your head, it's not good. It's really bad. So, a little old school mentor here advice, wear a helmet. I'm seeing an increase of it lately. And I'm an advocate of wearing a helmet. It's just a good idea. So be safe, have fun, and I hope you learned a couple things today, some names in skateboarding, some documentaries to check out. And that's about all. I could talk about skateboarding for a long, long time, and I don't plan on ever stopping. As long as I can move, I'll go, go, go. So, to keep up with what I'm up to, you can visit www.dougbrown.org, my official website. So on that note, keep skating. Like I always said back in the day, and I'll say it to you, skate or die, skate for life. Till next time, folks. Signing off for Method Airwaves, this is Doug Brown. Peace out.